It's a joy to see many of you gathered for one of our most cherished annual traditions. The Singh Lecture honors the life and legacy of the late Professor Surjit Singh, whose career and vision helped shape the theological landscape of this hill and beyond. You know, I never met Professor Singh in person, although I saw somebody who I thought was Professor Singh, but I did not have the courage to ask him, because I was a student here while he was still alive from 1998 to 2004. However, some years later, I had an encounter of sorts with his spirit. While working at Hartford Seminary. I was in the basement of the library in the archival room, and I was looking through documents to get some additional context of a legendary Korean theologian who graduated from there. And I came across the name Surjit Singh. There was a handwritten note. It says, "To Indian students this year, Surjit Singh." I forgot the other guy, but again, there was a Surjit Singh, and I was like, wait a minute, I remember this name. And it just clicked, and I said, this gotta be the same person. It all made sense to me to learn that Professor Singh earned his doctorate from school where the dialogue between Christianity and Islam was the norm. I am very proud to say that through this lecture series, we carry forward Dr. Singh's commitment for mutual learning, ethical reflection, and cultural encounter. That vision remains as vital as ever in today's world, where the need for empathy and understanding across traditions continue to grow. At the GTU, we are proud to sustain a learning community that invites the world's faith traditions into conversation, each contributing its own wisdom to the shared human quest for meaning and purpose for being here on this earth. Tonight's event is one more expression of that mission. Thank you to everyone who helped make this evening possible, and the Singh family, whose generosity established this lectureship decades ago. And now it is my pleasure to turn over this program to Dean Chris Acker.
Surjit Singh was professor of philosophy at the San Francisco Theological Seminary, and he was a member of the very first cohort of GTU doctoral faculty in 1962. He continued in the doctoral faculty until 1988 when he retired. Surjit was a passionate comparative theologian avant la lettre. In the generation of Raimundo Panikkar, Bede Griffiths, and Swami Abhishektananda, otherwise known as Henri Le Sceau. The analogies and similarities of Protestant Christologies after Hegel and Indian philosophy gripped his imagination. When I came to SFTS and the GTU in 1991, Surjit regaled me with insistent, complex discourses on these things. He treasured our common work in the PhD program. He thrived among our synergy of schools, preparing people for Christian ministry and interfaith leadership. When he could, and soon after he retired, he endowed this lectureship, calling us, a future generation, to join the sacred conversation of theologies that can help lead a troubled world to an era of peace. The last Singh lecture took place in 2022 when Jorge Cañizares Esquerra lectured on Mary as warrior virgin in colonial Latin America. To plan this year's lecture, I turned to two dear colleagues, Dean Abogonkinyan-Mege Orobator and Professor Marianne Farina, to help me plan the reviving lecture. Together they said, after very little deliberation, we need to hear from Norbert Litoing. We asked him to speak to us about African theology and the work of peacemaking. We are so glad that you have come to us from Nairobi to deliver this lecture. Dean Bator, Professor Farina, and I also wanted to explore ways to link the lecture to the experience of our students in the classrooms. And so we invited students to submit essays on any topic of comparative theology and peacemaking and to compete for a prize. We received compelling and interesting submissions. We recused ourselves from judging our own students. We invited Professor Antran to join our number, and after careful deliberation, we chose a winner, who is Innocent Mushebekwa Zihumanana, for his essay, The Catholic Church as a Body of Reconciliation. And Innocent is here with us tonight, and I'd like to recognize you and thank you for our essay and for joining us this evening. Professor Litoing has studied Islam at the University of Birmingham, theology at Boston College, and comparative theology at Harvard University, where his dissertation, just submitted last year, studied two pilgrimages. The annual pilgrimage of a Senegalese Sufi order, the Murid Brotherhood, to the Great Mosque of Touba and the tomb of Amadou Bamba, and the Catholic pilgrimage to Notre-Dame de la Délivrande in Popenguine. In his telling, both pilgrimages are cases of Africanization, one Muslim and one Christian. I think what brought us to you, Dr. Litoing, is our desire to understand better how two separate living traditions might form a symbiosis in a growing continental identity, which we on the outside of Africa too often see hopelessly fissured by colonial exploitation and post-colonial global competition for natural resources. Dr. Litoing is a Senegalese member of the Society of Jesus, the founding director of the Center for Interfaith Studies of Africa at Hekima College, the principal Jesuit University of Africa. And his lecture is called Teranga and the Stranger, an African Theology of Hospitality. The lecture will be followed by a response by Dr. Amir Hussain, a distinguished Islamic theologian, professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, a past president of the American Academy of Religion, a prolific author whose attention has focused on the history and character of Islam in America, the relationship of Islam and Christianity, interfaith relations more broadly, and the study of world religions. Amir, we invited you purely on your scholarly merits. Little did we know then that you were being recruited to join the GTU Board of Trustees. And he joins his first GTU trustee retreat and meeting tomorrow and Thursday, and I am very pleased to offer you a double welcome to the GTU as tonight's respondent and as a trustee. After Professor Hussain's response, there will be a brief time for questions, and after that, just to make sure you stay to the end, there will be a reception. Here in this room, it will be rolled out those doors to that back wall. We invite you to linger and enjoy continuing conversation after our more formal discussion then. And with that, I invite you to join me in welcoming Professor Litoing to the podium.
So good evening, everyone. Before I say anything else, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the Graduate Theological Union for the invitation to deliver this year's Surjit Singh lecture in comparative religion and theology. It is both humbling and deeply meaningful to be here among friends and colleagues committed to the work of dialogue and understanding across faith traditions. My special thanks go to Dean Christopher Oker, whose invitation, gracious welcome, and encouragement have made this occasion possible, and to Shelley Nelson, whose careful planning helped make the logistics of my trip so smooth. I'm equally grateful to Teresa Bowes for her part in arranging the details of my stay and ensuring that everything unfolded with ease and warmth. I would also like to acknowledge with deep affection and esteem Father Bonyamehe Orobato, Dean of the Jesuit School of Theology. Father Orobato was once my lecturer at Hekima University College in Nairobi, and I continue to look up to him as a mentor and inspiration. It took me just a few moments to realize that he was, in fact, the quiet force behind my invitation here this evening. The idea of the Center for Interfaith Studies in Africa, which I now have the privilege to direct, actually originated with him, and he has remained ever since a generous and steadfast supporter of the vision and work we strive to carry out at CISA. I'm also deeply grateful to Professor Amir Hussain, who will graciously offer a response to my paper. My first encounter with him at the Catholic Theological Society of America gathering in June 2022 in Atlanta, Georgia, left me with a warm and lasting impression. It is a joy to reconnect in this setting of theological friendship and exchange. Finally, I wish to thank my Jesuit brothers here at JST for their generous hospitality during my stay. Their warmth has made me feel at home from the moment I arrived, an experience most fitting for a lecture on hospitality. And as you may have noticed from the moment I uttered a word, English is not my first language. I speak it through the filter of other languages, each carrying its own rhythm and melody. Despite studying in the UK and the US, I made it a point to keep my accent, not only as a distinctive marker of identity, but also for the opportunity and indeed the pleasure to chastise your American ears on an evening like this one. To all of you gathered here tonight, faculty, students, and friends, thank you for your welcome, your presence, and the spirit of openness that animates this community. It is a joy and an honor to be among you. A stranger among friends. I still remember the first time I stepped off a plane in a country that was not my own. It was a chilly morning in Kigali, Rwanda, where I had arrived to begin my Jesuit formation. I had left my native Cameroon behind and was about to embark on what would become a life of living as a stranger. In the 23 years since that morning, I have been a guest in communities, cultures, and families not my own. Yet, it is precisely in this long experience of being a stranger that I have encountered the grace of hospitality most profoundly. Each place, whether on the misty hills of Cyangugu in Rwanda, along the bustling shores of Lake Tanganyika in Bujumbura, at Rompoengaba in Kinshasa, in the sun-baked parishes of Tambacounda in Senegal, beneath the white skies of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, amid the lively streets of Lomé in Togo, of Cotonou in Benin, in the classrooms and chapels of Nairobi, Kenya, along the storied banks of the Nile River in Cairo, Egypt, in the reflective halls of Birmingham in the UK, across the hopeful gatherings of Harare in Zimbabwe, by the quiet ocean breeze of Zinkwazi in South Africa, or in the academic home of Boston here in the US, each place has welcomed me not merely with words, but with spirit. It is difficult to describe this experience without invoking the Wolof word Teranga, a warmth of being that transcends politeness, a readiness to make space for another in one's life. During these years, I have been the guest of countless hosts. They have shared their food, their laughter, their homes, and more deeply, their faith. I have learned that hospitality is not about comfort, but about conversion. It is about being received in one's vulnerability and learning to see, as a Zulu of South Africa say, greetings Sawubona, which teaches that to see the other is to affirm their existence. I see you, say the Zulu. And they reply, Gikona, means I am here, for you have seen me. That reciprocity is a grammar of grace. This lecture is born of such encounters, of being a guest, of being seen, of being transformed. It also arises from my work in interfaith relations. My path into interreligious engagement was not born of theory, but of family. A cousin of mine fell in love with a Muslim lady, converted to Islam and married her. What could have been a story of division became instead one of encounter. Their relationship, at once tender and difficult, opened my eyes to the possibilities of dialogue grounded in affection rather than ideology. I began to see that the most enduring theology begins not in the library, but around the table where love and faith meet. I should add that I do not speak of hospitality or gratitude as a teacher, nor as one who has mastered its art, but rather as one who has been its grateful recipient. The reflections I share this evening do not arise from theory alone, but from the lived grace of being welcomed again and again by people who have made room for me in their hearts and their homes. This lecture, then, is offered not as an academic exercise in virtue, but as an act of gratitude, a small return to the many who, through their kindness, have taught me what it means to belong and to be at home in the world. My first point here, the stranger and the fragile world. As you know, we live in a world increasingly marked by the presence of the stranger. Migration, displacement, religious polarization, and social fragmentation make the stranger's figure both unavoidable and unsettling. The global refugee crisis, interreligious tensions, and the rise of exclusionary nationalisms have made hospitality not only a private virtue, but a public question. Who belongs? Who is welcome? And who decides? Theologians such as Johann Baptist Metz remind us that theology must begin in interruption, in the cry of the order that disturbs our settled certainties and calls us to conversion. The stranger is one such interruption. They resist assimilation. They reveal our limits, fears, and capacities, or failure to welcome difference. I recall my first days at Harvard University in August 2016, when a psychology professor of Indian descent offered us a simple yet profound piece of advice. Do not assimilate too quickly, she said. Do not lose your accent too quickly. Her words, spoken with gentle conviction, were more than a caution against conformity. They were an invitation to authenticity. In her own way, she reminded us that difference is not a barrier to encounter, but its very condition. To lose one's accent too quickly is to risk silencing the histories, languages, and worlds that shape our voice. It is, in a sense, to close a space of dialogue before it even begins. I came to realize that the accent we carry, whether linguistic, cultural, or spiritual, is a trace of where we come from and a gift we bring into every encounter. Preserving it is not an act of resistance, but of generosity. It allows others to meet us as we truly are, and in that meeting, both hosts and guests are transformed. Theologically, it gestures towards the mystery of the incarnation, the God who does not erase difference, but speaks through it, who enters history with an accent. Every human accent, then, is a sign of divine hospitality, a reminder that God's word continues to take flesh in many tongues, inviting us to listen for grace in the unfamiliar sound of another's speech. Hospitality, then, is not mere kindness or social courtesy. It is a theological act, a way of encountering the divine in the face of the other. The Ugandan theologian Emmanuel Katongole reminds us that a stranger is a test of our humanity. The refusal of hospitality is a root of our violence. His insight pierces to the heart of our contemporary world, where fear of the other so often fuels exclusion, hostility, and indifference. To welcome the stranger is to resist these forces of dehumanization and to participate in God's own movement towards the world. It is to recognize that divine grace often approaches us in unfamiliar form, through accents we do not understand, customs that unsettle us, and faces that disrupt our comfort. Hospitality thus becomes a form of spiritual discernment, the capacity to perceive God where we least expect to find God. In this sense, every act of welcome is also an act of faith. It is to believe that the divine presence exceeds our boundaries, and that in receiving the stranger, we receive a visitation of grace, just as Abraham did under the oaks of Mamre, or the disciples on the road to Emmaus. My second point, Teranga, the heart of Senegalese hospitality. Few African traditions capture the spirit of hospitality more beautifully than the Senegalese concept of Teranga. Often described as the identity card of Senegal, Teranga represents a lived ethos of openness, generosity, and solidarity that defines social life. While often translated as hospitality, the French or English terms dilute its depth. Etymologically, Teranga comes from teral, to welcome, and gan, foreigner or stranger, literally to welcome the stranger. It is both verb and vocation. In Senegal, Teranga is visible in everyday acts: the shared meal, the open door, the warm greeting, the refusal to let anyone eat alone. But its essence lies deeper. It expresses a worldview in which existence itself is relational, and the human person becomes truly human through generosity and belonging. The value of Teranga transcends ethnicity. Among the Serer, another ethnic group in Senegal apart from the Wolof, Teranga means glory in the sense of glorifying the other. For the Manjak, yet another ethnic group, Pied Lambangnam combines verbs of welcome, giving, and gratitude. Among the Jola, hospitality is regal. The guest is treated like a king. In each case, the same conviction shines through. The guest is not an intruder, but a bearer of blessing. Historically, Teranga emerged and flourished in the trading posts of northern Senegal, Saint-Louis and Gorée, where Africans and Europeans met and mingled. Welcoming the other was essential for coexistence and survival. After independence, Léopold Sédar Senghor, Senegal's first president, elevated Teranga into a national symbol, calling it the soul of the Senegalese people and the key to unity amid diversity. In Senghor's vision of the rendezvous du donner et du recevoir, the encounter of giving and receiving, Teranga becomes not just cultural etiquette, but a national and even theological vocation. Third, Teranga's theological ethic. Theologically, Teranga reveals a sacramental vision of life. As Abongyamehe Orobato writes, African life is sacramental because divine grace is mediated through ordinary gestures of generosity and sharing. To offer Teranga is thus to participate in God's own hospitality, the divine welcome that sustains creation. African anthropology, captured in the spirit of Ubuntu through the dictum, I am because we are, grounds this theology in relational identity. The host and guest are mutually transformed. The host's generosity confers dignity. The guest's presence bestows blessing. In this reciprocity lies the heart of Teranga, a hospitality that mirrors a Trinitarian life of mutual self-giving. In the Christian tradition, the command to welcome the stranger is not merely a moral injunction, but a participation in the very hospitality of Christ himself. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. This encounter with the other is thus an encounter with the divine, a sacramental moment in which God's presence is revealed through human action. As Laurenti Magesa, the Tanzanian theologian of blessed memory, observes, to receive another is to receive life itself, highlighting that hospitality is not a secondary virtue, but central to the moral and spiritual life. It is through welcoming the stranger that Christians are drawn into the rhythm of divine generosity, learning that life is shared, that vulnerability is transformative, and that recognition of the other reflects the image of God within them. Biblical narratives reinforce this vision. Abraham's reception of the three strangers at Mamre, the Good Samaritan's care for the injured traveler, and the disciples' encounter with Christ on the road to Emmaus all model a hospitality that opens the guest to blessing and the host to conversion. In this light, Christian hospitality becomes a form of ethical and spiritual theology, where to welcome another is to witness to God's love concretely and courageously in the world. In Islam, hospitality is a prophetic virtue, deeply rooted in both ethical teaching and spiritual formation. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "Let whoever believes in God and the last day honor his guest," establishing the treatment of guests as a marker of faith and devotion. Hospitality in Islam is not simply a matter of etiquette or generosity. It is an enactment of God's mercy, a tangible manifestation of ethical responsibility, and a test of sincerity in faith. The Quran and Hadith literature repeatedly emphasize care for strangers, neighbors, and the marginalized, framing such acts as integral to communal cohesion and spiritual accountability. Like Christianity, Islam presents hospitality as reciprocal. The host offers welcome and protection, and the guest brings dignity and the opportunity for the host to exercise virtue. In African Muslim context, this ethos is often expressed through shared meals, open doors, and ceremonies of generosity, reinforcing the belief that to honor the other is to honor God. Hospitality then functions as both a moral compass and a spiritual practice, shaping communities and fostering a relational ethic that reflects divine generosity in everyday life. In Senegal, where Muslims and Christians live side by side, Teranga has become a shared moral language. The custom of Catholics preparing galak, millet porridge, during Easter and sharing it with their Muslim neighbors, just as Muslims share meat with their Christian friends during Eid al-Adha, beautifully illustrates how hospitality in Senegal transcends creed and becomes a tangible sign of God's inclusive generosity. In these reciprocal gestures, sweet millet porridge at Easter and sacrificial meat at Eid, the boundaries of religion give way to a deeper communion of care, where faith expresses itself not through doctrine alone, but through the generosity of the table. My next point is a silent theology of the table, hospitality and the bol commun, or the common bowl. In Senegal, hospitality is not only spoken or enacted through formal gestures, it is also expressed in what might be called a silent theology of the table, most vividly embodied in the bol commun, the common bowl, shared among all present. At mealtimes, the bol commun transforms ordinary food into a space of encounter, communion, and moral instruction. Each person partakes directly from the same vessel, a gesture that embodies equality, mutual respect, and the recognition of the other as fully human. Yet, this sharing is guided by care and attentiveness. Around the bowl, there is often someone designated to look after the guest, ensuring that each guest receives the best portions of whatever protein is on offer, chicken, beef, or fish, so that no guest is left wanting or overlooked. And silence at the table is not emptiness, but attentiveness, a form of teaching that gestures towards a deeper truth. Generosity is measured not only in what is given, but in the care, discernment, and presence one brings to the act of sharing. In this shared bowl, the boundaries between host and guest are blurred. Each participant becomes both receiver and giver, and in that reciprocity, the community is sanctified. The bol commun thus becomes a theological metaphor. The table is a locus where social, ethical, and spiritual life converge, and where the divine hospitality mirrored in sacred text, Christian or Islamic, is lived concretely, relationally, and attentively. The stranger, encounter, and conversion. My own encounter with Teranga has been both theological and profoundly personal. As I mentioned, years ago, my cousin's marriage to a Muslim lady invited me into deeper reflection. Could love across religious boundaries be a form of divine hospitality? Could the simple, everyday acts of care, patience, and respect in a family setting reveal something of God's own welcome? That question has shaped my vocation in interfaith work, reminding me that dialogue is not first about theology books or debates, but about the lived encounter with the other. Today, at the Center for Interfaith Studies in Africa at Hekima University College, I have learned that encounters across difference, sometimes awkward, often surprising, can become sites of grace. Francis Clough calls comparative theology faith-seeking understanding across religious boundaries, and his words resonate with my experience. To enter another's faith world is to become their guest, and in doing so, to risk being transformed. Marian Moyayet similarly observes that interreligious encounter is a risky act of hospitality. To welcome another into the intimate space of one's beliefs, rituals, and convictions is to expose oneself to uncertainty, humility, and even challenge. Yet it is precisely this risk that carries the possibility of growth. Both the guest and the host are reshaped, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly in the encounter. In this sense, Teranga becomes not only a cultural practice, but a spiritual method for theology. to learn through welcome, to be converted through encounter, and to discover God in the life of the other. Hospitality here is not sentimental. It is ethical, relational, and deeply formative. It demands attentiveness, generosity, and the willingness to be changed. Concrete examples of this transformative power abound. In Nigeria, the work of Pastor James Huyi and Imam Muhammad Ashafa, once enemies during religious violence in Kaduna, offers a living parable of reconciliation. Their partnership at the Interfaith Mediation Center demonstrates that true dialogue begins where vengeance ends. Their friendship embodies what I would call interreligious Teranga, a readiness to share life, not merely arguments, a commitment to mutual recognition, empathy, and co-creation of peace. Like the shared meal in a Senegalese home or the ball commer, their encounter shows that genuine hospitality is a form of relational theology. It is through the concrete practice of welcoming the stranger, whether in family, community, or faith, that conversion and reconciliation become possible. Teranga then is both method and ethic, personal and communal, practical and theological. It reminds us that faith is never abstract. It is lived in the willingness to open oneself to the other, to risk discomfort, and to discover that the stranger, in their presence and vulnerability, can be a profound source of divine revelation. My next point is sacramental imagination. Interreligious Teranga, like the shared ball commer in Senegalese homes, can be understood as part of a broader African sacramental imagination, in which the divine is encountered in ordinary relational acts, just as a common bowl transforms a simple meal into a space of blessing, care, and mutual recognition. Interfaith encounters transform human relationships into sites where grace is made tangible. Each gesture of welcome, each moment of attentiveness to the other functions sacramentally. It signifies the presence of God in the unfamiliar, the stranger, and the culturally different. In this light, African hospitality becomes a theology in practice, a lived reflection of the sacred in which host and guest, Christian and Muslim, come together to experience divine generosity. The shared table and the shared life both teach that faith is never solitary. It is discovered, affirmed, and deepened in the encounter with the other, revealing that to welcome the stranger is to participate in the ongoing incarnate hospitality of God. It is from this understanding of hospitality as both relational and sacramental that we can approach the Senegalese practice of Teranga with deeper insight. Teranga is not merely a cultural custom or polite etiquette. It is a lived theology, a moral and spiritual grammar through which communities embody welcome, care, and generosity. Just as interreligious encounters transform human relationships into sites of grace, Teranga transforms everyday life into spaces where the stranger is honored, the guest is cherished, and both host and guests are enriched. By attending to the rhythms of giving and receiving, of seeing and being seen, we begin to grasp how this ethic of hospitality functions as a spiritual method, a communal ethic and a theological vision all at once. In the practices surrounding Teranga, particularly the shared ball commer, we find a concrete expression of the principles I have been reflecting on, that welcome, attentiveness, and mutual recognition are not peripheral virtues, but the very medium through which the divine is encountered and human communities are sanctified. Seeing and being seen, the spirituality of Sawubona. The Zulu greeting Sawubona, I see you or we see you, illuminates a spirituality at the very heart of Teranga. To see another person fully is to recognize their dignity, to affirm their existence, and to invite them into genuine community. It is an act of acknowledgement that transcends mere words. It is a recognition that the other is a subject, not an object, whose presence carries both value and responsibility. The response, Gikona, I am here, expresses a profound truth. I become fully myself because I am seen. This mutual recognition forms a foundational rhythm of relational life, one in which both hosts and guests are transformed by the act of presence. Hospitality, therefore, begins not with what we give materially, but with how we see. Catherine Corney describes this as the hospitality of the heart, a disposition of humility, attentiveness, and openness that makes authentic dialogue possible. In a world where so many remain unseen, refugees, migrants, the marginalized, and religious minorities, African traditions remind us that seeing is itself an act of care, a prayer, and a moral responsibility. To behold the other attentively is to participate in grace. It is to acknowledge that each human encounter carries the potential to reveal something sacred. Sawubona thus deepens Teranga into a spirituality of presence, where hospitality is inseparable from attentiveness, and where ethical and theological life converge in the simple but profound act of truly seeing the other. African theology in this light calls us not only to welcome the stranger, but to perceive the stranger as revelation. The encounter with the other becomes a mirror, reflecting both our own humanity and the image of God in the other. In the words of Johann Baptist Metz, one could describe the stranger as embodying a dangerous memory, one that disturbs complacency, challenges assumptions, and opens us to conversion and grace. To practice Teranga is therefore to cultivate this spiritual sight, the eyes and heart attuned to the divine presence in every human being, to the sacred in the ordinary. And as Metz puts it in his Theology of Remembrance, Christians are called to discern traces of God in the footprints of those who pass through our lives, participating in a mysticism of open eyes that finds the holy in each encounter. In this sense, the Zulu greeting and the response are more than etiquette. They are a practice of seeing as a moral, spiritual, and theological discipline, one that enacts God's presence through attentive human relationships. Now, challenges and renewal of Teranga. Yet Teranga faces real and persistent challenges. While it offers a profound model of hospitality, generosity, and relational ethics, I do not seek here to romanticize African cultures of welcome, of hospitality. The ideal of hospitality remains fragile, often distant, and sometimes unattainable. Xenophobia is a very real threat on the continent, as are ethnic and regional tensions that can make the stranger seem unwelcome rather than embraced. Even within Africa, freedom of movement is heavily restricted. Of the 53 African nations, only 4, Rwanda, Benin Republic, Ghana, and Kenya, permit entry to any African without a visa. Senegal is not one of those 4. These structural barriers, alongside economic disparities and historical legacies of conflict, show that hospitality in practice is often constrained by politics, law, and circumstance. Globalization and what Pope Francis called the globalization of indifference further erode communal bonds and foster a turn towards individualism. Economic hardship can breed suspicion and exploitation, while social challenges, fraud, tourist prostitution in the case of Senegal, and parasitic dependence threaten the very virtues that undergird Teranga. The generosity and openness that Teranga celebrates are therefore continually tested by the realities of inequality, social fragmentation, and human self-interest. To safeguard Teranga is not simply to preserve a cultural custom, therefore. It is to renew it from its spiritual and theological roots, reminding ourselves of its deeper meaning and purpose. The practice of welcome is an ethical and spiritual act, an opportunity to resist dehumanization and embody divine hospitality in everyday life. Senegal's enduring peace and interreligious harmony offer powerful testimony that Teranga is more than etiquette or ritual. It is a living social theology, a communal ethic, and a parable of grace. Yet, the work of renewal demands vigilance, creativity, and humility. It requires that communities confront their failings, that nations reconsider the barriers they erect, and that each individual cultivate attentiveness, generosity, and courage in the face of the stranger. Only through such sustained effort can Teranga remain a beacon of hope, a lived example of how African societies might embody the radical welcome that sustains both human and divine life. Finally, my conclusion towards a radical welcome. At its deepest level, the renewal of Teranga calls us to embrace a radical welcome, one that transcends comfort, convenience, and narrow self-interest. This welcome is not merely a social courtesy. It is a theological act, a participation in the divine hospitality that shapes creation itself. To offer radical welcome is to recognize a stranger, not as a threat or a problem to be managed, but as a bearer of blessing, a revelation of God's presence in the unfamiliar. In a world marked by fear, exclusion, and inequality, Teranga challenges us to cultivate attentiveness, generosity, and courage in the face of difference. It is a practice that resists the forces of indifference, xenophobia, and fragmentation, insisting that human communities flourish only when life is shared and dignity affirmed. In this sense, the stranger at our door is not a burden, but a promise, a call to conversion, a reminder that hospitality, properly understood, is both gift and responsibility. To live Teranga today is to participate in a vision of society where welcome is not conditional, where encounter is transformative, and where God's radical grace is made visible through human acts of care, recognition, and love. In every act of welcome, may we recognize that to see, to receive, and to share is to participate in the radical hospitality of God. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you. Thank you. As a Muslim, I begin with thanks. There's in the Quran, the word for unbelief, kufr, is often contrasted with the word shukr, thanks. And the theological implication is clear. The person who is not thankful is the person who does not believe. So thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to President Kim for starting us off. Thanks to Professor Oker for that marvelous introduction. Thanks to Father Bator and Sister Marianne for inviting me to be here for a response to this brilliant Surjit Singh lecture in comparative religion and theology that we just heard from Father Norbert Litoing. Thanks to Father Litoing for that magisterial and beautifully written lecture. Thank you. I offer my brief remarks, because I know I'm keeping you from the reception, in memory of our blessed Jesuit brother, Father Patrick Joseph Ryan. Sorry. It's hard to speak of him in the past tense, who passed away in his native New York on August 9th, 2025. Sorry, I didn't know I was going to do that. Pat was a Jesuit priest who spent almost half of his adult life working with Muslims in West Africa. Like Norbert, Pat also did his PhD at Harvard University, so there's another connection between these two men. Pat working with the Blessed Anna Marie Schimmel. Norbert, no disrespect to the comparative theologians here, with the greatest living scholar of comparative theology, Frank Clooney. Frank is also a Jesuit. I teach in Jesuit University. The Jesuits will beat me if in any public setting I don't mention their expertise, so I hope I'm safe there talking about Frank. But unlike Norbert, Pat was an Irish priest, straight out of central casting, with the Irish lilt and the red hair. Nevertheless, he was fluent in several African languages. And when we would travel together in New York City, he'd see the taxi driver's name on his license, be able to tell from the name where in West Africa the driver was from, and start speaking to him in his native language. Startled, the taxi driver would look back at me and then realize that it wasn't a Pakistani Muslim that was speaking to him in Wolof, but the American Irish Catholic priest. So I love, and Pat would have loved also, the use of the term in Wolof, Teranga, as the theme of Norbert's lecture. I also love the theme of the stranger in the connection to hospitality, and it made me think of two different quotes about being a stranger from across the centuries. The first, and you have to excuse the lack of gender-inclusive language since it came from Hugh of St. Victor in the 12th century, is the man who finds his homeland sweet is still a tender beginner. He to whom every soil is as his native land is already strong. But he is perfect to whom the entire world is a foreign land. The second is, ain't nothing but a stranger in this world. Nothing but a stranger in this world. that many of you recognize from Van Morrison's Astral Weeks in the 20th century. Those few of you that know me know that I think in music. And so I very much appreciate Norbert's line. I'm quoting here. I began to see that the most enduring theology begins not in the library, but around the table, where love and faith meet. I love that emphasis, not on the literary or the textual, but on the visceral, on the table spread, the food that we share. This follows the practice in Jesuit pedagogy of cura personalis, education of the whole person. For me, the visceral is also in the music that we share. I've never been to Senegal, but I know it through the beauty of the singer, Youssou N'Dour, who I first heard in September of 1988 on the Human Rights Now tour in support of the 40th anniversary of the UN Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Youssou is a Muslim, culturally Wolof, who often sings songs in praise of the Prophet, as well as songs in praise of the leader of his Sufi order that Norbert studied, the Blessed Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba. In thinking about the interfaith connections with Teranga, I went back to one of my favorite lines in the Quran from Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 36, and the quote from the Quran is this: "Serve God and do not associate anything with God, and be good to both your parents and to the near of kin and the orphans and the needy and the neighbor who is near and the neighbor who is farther away and the companion by your side and the traveler and those whom your right hands possess. Surely God does not love the one who is proud, boastful." And it's important to remember that what I've translated as "and be good" is even more powerful in the Arabic original of the Quran, which reads "ihsanan," literally do something beautiful for the people it then lists. The Quranic text is explicit that our doing goodness and showing beauty is not limited to our family, but to those in need, whether they are literally our neighbor or are far away from us, the stranger. It is the same emphasis that is found in both the Torah and the New Testament. Do not oppress the stranger, for you were once strangers in Egypt. Or the gospel passage that Norbert read from Matthew 25, which, as it happens, is also my favorite gospel text. But there's also a connection to a passage from my favorite gospel, that of Mark. How many of you are familiar with the story of the Syrophoenician woman in Mark's gospel, Mark 7:24-30? Those 7 short lines vex me from the time that I read them as a graduate student. And this is it. This is Mark 7:24-30. From there, Jesus arose, went to the region of Tyre and Sidon, and he entered a house and wanted no one to know it. But he could not be hidden. For a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord." Sorry, I didn't know they were going to do this either. "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." And then he said to her, "For this saying, go on your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter." And when she had come to her house, she found the demon gone out and her daughter lying on the bed. So my problem with the story was that this didn't seem to be the gentle and loving Jesus. In the story, he's tired. He goes to the coastal regions of Tyre and Sidon. I can relate to that. As an Angelino, the water's a nice way to rid yourself of your worries. Glad they closed the curtains so we don't have to look out at the water. The woman asks not for help for her, but for her daughter. She's in the triple category of being othered: a woman, a foreigner, a non-Jew. Jesus comes not for her or her kind, but for the chosen, the children. Only way I could make sense of this was through one of my teachers at the University of Toronto, the blessed Mennonite scholar, Bill Clough. Bill taught us that this passage reflects Jesus as God, with a twinkle in his eye, who knows what the woman knows what she's going to be able to say. But that didn't work for me. However, I learned from a Catholic, Father Elias Mallon, a very different interpretation. Father Mallon taught us that we read this as docetics, who think of Jesus only in his divine nature. We forget the humanity of Jesus. What if we heard this as Jesus learning from the foreign, non-Jewish woman, his role? That it is the stranger, the woman, the non-Jew who teaches Jesus. That he has come for all, not just for the chosen. To echo a song by a Canadian singer, Bruce Cockburn, I need to further disclose as a Canadian, I'm required by Canadian law in any major gathering outside of Canada, especially since the beginning of this year, to mention at least one Canadian artist by name. It's Bruce Cockburn, The Cry of a Tiny Babe, written in Toronto. For the benefit of your ears, I will not sing these words. But Bruce writes, "There are others who know about this miracle birth. The humblest of people catch a glimpse of their worth. For it isn't to the palace that the Christ child comes, but to shepherds and street people, hookers and bums. And the message is clear if you have ears to hear, that forgiveness is given for your guilt and your fear." We are connected as Muslims to other religious communities. Sometimes, as Norbert pointed out, there's a disconnect or a lack of hospitality. Here, I think especially today, on Election Day in these United States, of another poet, the Blessed Langston Hughes, and his magisterial poem, I Too. I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. And of course, this poem reminds me of a story about my childhood hero, the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali. After winning an Olympic gold medal in Rome in 1960 as an 18-year-old, I was doing a lot of things when I was 18. Representing my country at the Olympics was not one of them. You know? But he wasn't allowed to eat in the restaurants of his native Louisville because he was the wrong color. You know? Many people know the song "The Greatest Love of All," made famous by Whitney Houston. However, some aren't aware that the song was written about Ali and first recorded by George Benson for a 1977 film about Ali's life, The Greatest. But the lyrics, written by Linda Creed, are clearly about Ali and his impact on America. Hear those again. And again, believe me, I won't sing them. I decided long ago never to walk in anyone's shadows. If I fail, if I succeed, at least I'll live as I believe. No matter what they take from me, they can't take away my dignity. That too is crucial, that in any act of hospitality, we do it with dignity. I began my response in memory of Pat Ryan, and I returned to him to conclude. Pat was the one. I knew him for 15 years or so. I miss him. I miss that voice with the Irish lilt. I miss that sense of humor. Pat was one of the key Jesuit scholars doing comparative work on Islam, and so his death is a loss to all of us who work in comparative theology. Sadly, there are too many places across these United States that claim that there's no time for comparative work, when one must focus on Christology and historical theology and moral theology and systematic theology and so on. By contrast, Jesuit institutions in Africa or Asia do not have the luxury to share this American exceptionalism. You know? With the exception of the Philippines, they have to work in a world where the day-to-day lived reality is more likely to be with Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or practitioners of traditional religions than with fellow Christians, let alone with other Catholics. Perhaps we here in America might one day be able to learn this truth that Pat often taught us, which is the idea behind the GTU and behind these magnificent Surjit Singh lectures, and which Norbert reminded us of in his magisterial lecture, that there's more to theological vision that is contained in any one religious tradition, or that the goal of interfaith dialogue is not that we seek to convert each other, but that we help each other to find what is meaningful in our own religious traditions. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
Father Norbert, thank you for your lecture, and Professor Amir, thank you so much for your response. Let's just focus on Senegal, since you brought up Senegal, and not Cameroon or Nigeria or a lot of other places we could talk about tonight. In Senegal, you mentioned this ritual of hospitality, the one bowl, the one plate. So what happens in Senegal when there's conflict? When there's maybe the two tribes are not getting along, or there's an incident between Muslims and Christians. From what you presented, what kinds of models of conflict resolution are there as well?
Thank you very much for that question. And indeed, at times there are tensions between communities, there are conflicts. One of the most recent ones for an article I've been working on is connected to the question of the veil, for instance. I think some of the debates about the veil in the context of France have made their way into Senegal, where in Catholic schools they have started asking that Muslim girls do not wear the veil. I've spoken to some of the sisters involved, and they explained to me that it wasn't all that much about the veil, but they have noticed a change, that these girls have started self-segregating, refusing to sit with boys in school, refusing to do PT, physical education, yeah. So they say that they have started self-segregating. So that has sparked debates within Senegalese society. And things I never heard several years ago in Senegal, when I was reading comments on the articles online, comments that you will have never heard so many years ago in Senegal, you hear them today. So you feel as if, one can feel as if positions between faith community, people are getting a bit more radicalized in their language, a bit much more exclusive in the way they look at each other. So there are tensions. But again, that 2006 survey, one of the things that came out, apart from Teranga, one thing that stood out as helping with this harmony and helps with conflict resolution is what is known as joking kinship. I don't know if you are familiar with the notion. So, joking kinship, generally from those from Africa, yeah, if I get it wrong, please correct me. Joking kinship has to do with the type of relationship that can exist between members of two different ethnic groups, such that if you are not familiar with the existence of a joking kinship between those two ethnic groups, when two members of that group meet each other and recognize each other as members of those two ethnic groups, you might get scandalized. For instance, between the Mosi and the Samo of Burkina Faso, when they meet, my rector, Father Foro, is a Samo, and then some of the scholastics in the community are Mosi. So when they meet, the first person to speak will say to the other, "You are my slave." Yeah. You can't be shocked if you are not part of the culture. But that's a way of, and they laugh about it. But that joking kinship, that kind of relationship comes into play when there are tensions between communities. Elders of either community can sit down and resolve those tensions without those tensions resulting into direct violence. So they still rely on that cultural element. Like, for instance, between the Sere and the Fulani in Senegal, they consider themselves as cousins, and they have that joking kinship. And there have been instances in the history of the country where, because of tensions between communities, the elders of the two communities have had to come and sit down and call on people to calm down. Even with the issue of the veil, some of those who helped calm down the tension were religious leaders issued from these different communities, be able to tell people, okay, you calm down, we are going to find a solution to this, etc. So culture in Senegal really plays a very important role as a social glue, really, for people. That's just one example, the joking kinship. There could be other structures within the country, but that's one that is very operative in the context of Senegal.
For me, it is, first of all, I know now because as he was sharing 23 years ago,
Yes.
you just confronted the unknown and you came to my country, and for information, I started that journey together with him, but at least for me, I was still in my country. I was not so foreign. as such. And one thing that you say that really touched me, it is where you say that it is around a table where there is love and faith, that the encounter with the stranger can just materialize, and the Teranga spirit can be manifested. But at the same time, let me now go into the Bible and make us understand that around the table also, that's where there was this concept of gaze and the power dynamic comes at play. You can take the example of the episode where there was Jesus invited into Simon's house, and there was this woman who comes, and the gaze that was on her, it was as if she was a foreign and she was not supposed to be there, and there was power dynamics. And that's why I want to ask you, how is gaze and power dynamics operative in what you have explored?
That's a very good question, Pierre Celestin. And as Pierre Celestin rightly pointed out, we joined the novitiate, the Jesuit novitiate, the same day, on the 1st of August 2002, with him and with the great Egide seated at the back there. So I'm meeting my two novice mates. I had had the blessing of seeing Egide a few years ago in Abidjan, but with Pierre Celestin, since we finished in 2004, meeting him for the first time, I had to come to Berkeley to meet him, 21 years after. Yeah, so thank you for that question, and thank you really for the generous hospitality really in Rwanda. One of the things that has remained for me as a memory of that time was the fact that when we finished our novitiate and took our first vows on the 31st of July 2004, I remember Pierre Celestin asking me, "Is your mother coming?" I said, "No, it's too far. She's in Cameroon, she's not coming." He said, "Okay." He didn't say anything, but on the day of the vows, when his mother arrived, she had a gift for me, and she had a gift for the other two Cameroonians whose parents were not going to be able to come. Yeah, sadly, she passed on in 2023. God rest her soul. So thank you, really, for that hospitality. Now, the question of the gaze is very true. It's one of my favorite gospel passages, actually. Jesus at the home of Simon the Pharisee. I like contrasting the gaze of Jesus with the gaze of Simon the Pharisee, the ways in which they differ in the way they perceive this woman who comes in and encounters Jesus. In the case of what I'm sharing here in terms of Teranga and sharing around this common bowl, if I had the opportunity, I would have showed you the image of people actually dipping their hands. In Senegal, even rice and everything, people eat with their hands. You clean your hands and you eat together. It's the most intimate thing you can do in terms of inviting someone to partake of your meal in that bowl. It's the ultimate sign of trust. You will not invite someone you do not trust to dip their hands in the same bowl with you. You do not know what they're going to do. And around that bowl, one of the things that happens is that generally there's someone designated. It could be the oldest woman in the house. It could be, if they are all men around the bowl, it could be the main man of the house welcoming you, who will be tasked with sitting next to the guest. It could be on your left or on your right. And as you are eating, he's not saying anything. From time to time, he'll cut a piece of the meat or the fish, etc., the best pieces, and pushing it in front of you to make sure that you have the best and you constantly eat. For me, at the beginning, it was a cultural shock. We don't do the same in my culture in the north of Cameroon. So I'll tell them, "Oh, you eat also. You don't have to be sending it my way." But they insist on doing that. In that particular setting, coming back to your question about power dynamics, in that particular setting, the guest is made to feel that you are the most important person here. I'm ready not to eat as long as you eat. I want you to eat. And during my PhD work at Harvard, every summer I had the opportunity, for five years, I had the opportunity to take students, undergrads from Harvard, to Senegal for 2 months. We had a course entitled Belief, Culture, and Society in Francophone Africa. And one of the cultural shocks for the students most of the time is that one will be in a family home and they'll be eating. These were American kids. They'll be eating, and our host will keep saying, "Leka, leka, leka, eat, eat, eat." That's the culture in Senegal. They will insist that you keep eating. Why? Because in that context, if at the end of your stay, your guest goes back fat, that's a very good sign. You have welcomed that guest the way you should. Yeah. So the objective is to fatten you as much as possible. So eat. The students were finding it at times annoying, but we had to explain to them, okay, for them it's a sign of hospitality. It's not that they want to invade your own private space or anything. It's because they want you to put on weight so that by the end of your stay, people will say you were really welcomed in Senegal the way you should. That for them is a sign of welcome. So around that table, the guest is really meant to feel you are the most powerful person here. You are the most important person here. And we want you to have the best.
Thank Norbert and Amir one more time.